Welcome to the Mondo Weiss podcast. I'm your host, Dave Reed. At Mondo Weiss, we cover the movements, activists, and policymakers who affect the struggle for freedom in Palestine. Last month, the U.S. held its midterm elections. A red wave never materialized as many predicted, but Republicans did take control of the House of Representatives. Our U.S. correspondent Michael Arria caught up with author and Georgetown University adjunct professor Josh Ruebner to talk about how Israel factored into the races and what we should expect from the new Congress on Palestine. Ruebner is the author of Israel, Democracy or Apartheid State and Shattered Hopes, Obama's Failure to Broker Israeli-Palestinian Peace. He is an adjunct professor at Georgetown University.
So, Josh, thanks for joining us. I wanted to start maybe by talking about the Israel lobby's impact on these midterms. What did you see that stood out to you in terms of their spending during these elections, and what were your big takeaways?
Well, I think it's important to note why we saw this huge shift in strategy this year by the Israel lobby engaging more in electoral politics and funding those campaigns. So I want to back up a step first and talk about the growing support we're seeing for Palestinian rights in Congress. So the congressional session that's ending in December this year has seen the most, by far, of any Congress that we've seen up till now in terms of pro-Palestinian and Palestinian rights initiatives, whether we're talking about Representative McCollum's bill to protect Palestinian children under Israeli military occupation, whether we're talking about AOC introducing a groundbreaking resolution to cut off weapons to Israel, whether we're talking about Representative Andre Carson introducing a bill to get some accountability for Israel's killing of Shireen Abu Akleh, and we can go on and on and on and talk about all of the different initiatives we've seen. This is what is making the Israel lobby fearful, this growing solidarity that we're seeing amongst largely the progressive wing in Congress for Palestinian rights. And so they decided on a very clear strategy to try to stop that momentum from building further, which was by inserting themselves into the Democratic primary process and funding it massively. It's important to note that between AIPAC's PAC and its super PAC, along with some other pro-Israel lobby organizations, they spent somewhere to the tune of $60 to $70 million when all is counted in terms of trying to defeat candidates who are progressive and who were standing for Palestinian rights. So it's a very reactive mode, and it was a very effective strategy that was implemented by the Israel lobby, because we saw how in many cases in the primary, this intervention made the difference in terms of electing a corporate Democrat who is more friendly to Israeli apartheid and defeating progressive Democrats. But that being said, I don't want to overstate the significance of what the Israel lobby was able to achieve with this massive injection of money into the midterms, okay? Because still we're going to see the informal Palestine Rights Caucus in Congress grow next year, I think. And I think we'll see more diversity in terms of the numbers of different members of Congress who are willing to lead initiatives to support Palestine.
And connected to that, I mean, you already kind of just referenced it, but I have seen a lot of commentary about, the squad potentially expanding. And usually when people say that, they're referring to domestic progressive policies, stuff like the Green New Deal or Medicare for All. Do you think the squad seemingly expanding will have any impact on support for Palestinian rights? You just said you thought it could potentially expand. How do you foresee we frequently see the Palestine as a blind spot with many progressives. Do you have any? I know it's early, but how do you see that shaking out with this new crop of Congress people coming in?
I think it's a little too early to tell and to make prognostications about this. Even though I believe that the Israel lobby's injection of the $60 to $70 million worth of money into the primaries help to defeat some candidates, but won't necessarily stop the momentum. We can't be sure because this money could have a huge chilling impact. I think, though, the base of the Democratic Party, and especially the progressive base, will in general have to be more and more responsive as well to the base of the Democratic Party, which is becoming more and more firmly in support of Palestinian rights. So, with this recent Israeli election of the most fascist government ever in Israel's history, you will see more policy clashes between the United States and Israel. And there will be more opportunities, I think, for not only progressives, but liberal members of Congress as well to insert themselves into this conversation and to really press the United States on this issue. Because, I think what we're going to see in many respects is a return to the dynamics that we saw during the Obama years with the very fraught relations between President Obama and Prime Minister Netanyahu, which were, very, very personalized in the policy debate. It was de-emphasized the policy differences between them. But I think, you're going to see this really come to a head, especially in the next 2 years, with the Biden administration repeatedly clashing with the Netanyahu government, and especially its even more right-wing fascist ministers that we're seeing put in place. And I think that will afford many, many opportunities for members of Congress to take increasingly bold stands in support of Palestine.
You're talking about, Democratic voters coming around on the issue of Palestine in recent years, and even some lawmakers. I wanted to maybe turn to the situation in Florida's 10th district, which I'm sure you paid attention to. Maxwell Frost, who's fairly progressive when it comes to domestic stuff. A lot of articles about him as he's the first member of Generation Z to join the House. He had courted the support. Something we've covered at the site quite a bit, actually, is he courted the support of some local Palestinian groups in Florida, and then seemingly abandoned his political promises to them. I was just wondering your thoughts on that whole situation. What stood out to you, and what do you think? Do you think there's lessons from that situation to take away?
Well, as I understand it, he did more than just court Palestine rights organizations in his district, but he actually relied quite heavily upon them for the contacts, for the introductions, for the people power that he needed to really launch his campaign against a very crowded primary. So I think that he owed a great debt to those people who helped him get to where he is, which makes his throwing of the cause of Palestine under the bus even that much more problematic, I think. So, that is a lesson, I think, to everyone that, it's not enough to get verbal promises from candidates. We have to ensure that whatever promises are made, and I'm not saying that this is the case at all. In this case, I really don't know the details, but we really have to make sure that we get written promises from candidates if they want the support of people who believe in Palestinian rights, and that off the record conversations are not going to be adequate, especially because we know what's coming. We know what's coming in terms of the massive funding that's going to be put into any race where a candidate does take firm positions. But we've also seen how candidates for office can really capitalize in terms of their support for Palestinian rights, in terms of their own fundraising efforts. It's no longer the third rail of domestic politics, and certainly not of democratic politics, to be out and forceful and strong on the issue of Palestine. So, I just think that the main lesson here is not to rely on the good word and the goodwill of candidates, but really to get them to commit in writing to what they claim to represent, and to hold them to account. That being said, whatever Maxwell Frost has said and done on the campaign trail, he's going to be a newly elected member of Congress starting in January. And, he needs to be pressured and held accountable, just like any other member of Congress, regardless of his very problematic history of this on the campaign trail.
You referenced this a little already, but this recently announced investigation to the killing of Shireen Abu Akleh. It was recently reported that the Justice Department has launched its own independent investigation after we've seen pressure for months and months from activists, of course, her family, and ultimately democratic lawmakers. Israel, of course, has already come out and said they refuse to cooperate with this investigation in any capacity. Can you talk a little about the activism around this issue and how Congress was pressured to, finally get the FBI to take action?
Well, first and foremost, Shireen Abu Akleh's family deserves the credit for the activism that led to the opening of this FBI investigation. They have been absolutely fierce and relentless and determined to get accountability and justice for Israel's killing of Shireen ever since day one. And, they came to Washington, D.C. over the summer. As probably most of your listeners know, they had a meeting with Secretary of State Tony Blinken. They had a press conference on Capitol Hill at which 7 members of Congress spoke in solidarity with the family. And so they really deserve a lot of the credit for raising the stakes, raising the political pressure that was necessary to get this investigation started. Of course, they were supported in this effort by just about every single Palestine rights advocacy organization in the country that really put a lot of efforts into ensuring that an investigation would happen. And we saw that there were more than 80 Democratic members of Congress and even one Republican member of Congress who called for justice and accountability. The one Republican was Senator Mitt Romney. And I contrast this with other cases in which American citizens have been grievously injured or killed by Israel in the past. And, the most close parallel I can think of is Israel's killing of Rachel Corrie during the Second Intifada, where her parents, Cindy and Craig, and other members of her family spent the better part of 2 years in Washington, D.C., pounding the pavement, walking the halls of Congress, trying to get anyone to listen to them and join their calls for accountability. And there was a congressional resolution to that effect, that there should be a U.S. investigation into her killing. And I can't remember offhand the exact total number of members of Congress. But the fact is that despite their advocacy, which was, equally as fierce and determined as the Abu Akleh family's advocacy has been, they never were successful in terms of getting the United States to open up a probe and an investigation into Rachel's killing. So, in that sense, the opening of the FBI investigation into Shireen's killing is really unprecedented. It is the first time that I'm aware of in U.S. history where a U.S. citizen who has been injured or killed by Israel will receive at least an FBI investigation. And let's talk about why that's important for a second. It's not important as an end in and of itself, although it is a very important milestone, but it's even more important in terms of what it could lead to. So why does an FBI investigation take place? It takes place because the FBI has reason to believe that a crime may have been committed. This is what they're investigating. And in fact, we saw in the press accounts of the opening of the FBI investigation that indeed this is a criminal investigation. So what does this mean? If the FBI goes to Israel and conducts interviews and conducts whatever access they can get to the bullet and to other evidence, and finds that there is a criminal act that has taken place, there could be a request for the extradition of Israeli soldiers who were involved in the killing and in the order to shoot. So this would be hugely significant because obviously Israel, number one, is not cooperating with the investigation, and number two, obviously would never ever extradite an Israeli citizen to stand trial in the United States for a crime. But if it gets to that point, it's going to be a huge diplomatic incident. And I think it's going to turn even more Americans against further U.S. support for Israel. So it's extremely significant, and the really overwrought reaction that you saw from Israeli politicians, I think, attests to the fact that they consider this very serious as well.
And finally, this new Israel's new government, the most right-wing government in the history of the country, as many say, and their relationship with the Biden administration, which you made reference to earlier. A lot of parallels, as you say, with the Obama administration. Obviously, Biden being the vice president at the time, Netanyahu back from the dead, seemingly, in Israel. You literally wrote the book on Obama's failures when it came to pushing peace in the region. What should people be paying attention to going forward when they look at the continuing relationship between this administration and the new government in Israel?
Well, to answer that question, Michael, I think we have to step back a bit and look at the history of President Joe Biden on the issue of Israel and Zionism and the Palestinian people. As he's the first to attest to, he has, a half-century record of support for Israel. He spoke to a Jewish gathering in Detroit when he was vice president. I believe this was the speech in which he said this, and he talked about how he became a committed Zionist at his parents' kitchen table, where his father talked to him about the horrors of the Holocaust and the need of the Christian world to repent for that genocide by compensating the Jewish people with Israel and with ironclad support for Israel. So, this is the tired trope that Joe Biden has grown up with his entire life, and it's something that he's embraced when he went on his trip to Israel and the occupied Palestinian West Bank earlier this year, or shortly before. I can't remember if it was a few days before or during the trip, where he talked about how you don't have to be Jewish to be a committed Zionist, and that's very true. And so, this is who Joe Biden is. These are the policies that have animated his administration for the first 2 years. So I don't expect that we're going to see any dramatic developments out of the Biden administration over the next 2 years, no matter how egregious the new Israeli government is compared to the previous unity government. So the Biden administration, I think, is going to continue to try to place Israel and Palestine on the back burner and hope that things don't boil over. That has been their MO for the past 2 years, and it probably will continue this way as well. The Biden administration has adopted very strange talking points when it comes to the issue of Israel and the Palestinian people. So they've adopted this new rhetoric that doesn't match the rhetoric of any previous administration, that Israelis and Palestinians deserve equal measures of freedom, dignity, and security. And sometimes they throw in a few other words. And this is it's a very curious formulation, Michael, because there's no real policy implications to that. If they deserve equal rights, okay. I mean, who doesn't agree with that? Of course they deserve equal rights, but how are you going to manifest that? What does that even mean? And especially when you combine this with the Biden administration's stance that we're not even going to try to act and pretend like there is a possibility of Israeli-Palestinian negotiations taking place. And we're not even going to pretend that there's a possibility of establishing a Palestinian state in the foreseeable future, but we're just going to preserve the conditions that might make it possible for there to eventually be negotiations that will take place that will lead to a Palestinian state. So you see like how conditioned and how caveated the Biden administration's policy formulations are. And I think that really bespeaks a real lack of any vision and any motivation and any initiative for doing anything on this. They want to stay away from this issue with a 10-foot pole if they can. I don't know if events will allow them to. It could very well be that this new right-wing, even more fascist Israeli government that's coming into power will do something that will trigger something that can no longer be ignored by the Biden administration, that the day-to-day just kind of conflict management template will no longer work for the Biden administration. But I think they're certainly hoping that that will be the case. But we'll see. We'll see if they're able to continue this day-to-day strategy.
Well, Josh, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me, Michael.
Thanks for listening to our show. Visit our site to sign up for free daily and weekly newsletters on Palestine, Israel, and related U.S. politics. If you're enjoying our podcast, please consider becoming a donor by visiting mondoweiss.net/donate. Mondoweiss is a nonprofit publication, and every donation of any amount helps sustain our work. Don't forget to subscribe to this podcast wherever you listen, and please leave a rating and review to help other listeners find our show.